got a good crowd here. So what we're going to do is give you a chance to give your presentation about voting. And then we have Professor Daniel Faber, who's here at Northeastern doing research on climate change and sustainability, but also has an activist hat as well. And then also Dr. Gamal Mustafa, who's an expert on third world issues. So we're going to let you talk for about, I think, 20, 25 minutes, we agreed, about voting, and then we'll all come and then we'll ask you questions, you'll ask them questions, the students will have questions. And just so you know, what we've essentially been doing before this is outlining both the kind of corporate battle against climate change and all the kind of dark money issues, ExxonMobil, that's been going on, and then also looking at the increasing partisan divides on global warming and how it doesn't matter, what happens, what catastrophes there are, people seem, more and more divided. So do you want to introduce Nathaniel, or we'll have you introduce yourself? It's probably better.
Yeah, Nathaniel, you go ahead. I will just preface by saying Nathaniel is head of a great group called Environmental Voters, which had a ton of success in 2022 and some success as well in 2018. And he is now gearing up for the presidential, incredibly important year of 2024. So Nathaniel, thank you for being here.
It's my pleasure, Jill, and thanks to all of you. So because we have limited time and we want to get into some environmental politics discussions, what I'm going to do is just very, very briefly, like in 1 minute, talk about what we do at the Environmental Voter Project. And then I thought that there would be 3 topics that I would quickly want to touch on, having to do with really important points of leverage in modern environmental politics. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen here. And just in a nutshell, in case you're curious, this nonprofit that I run called the Environmental Voter Project is laser focused on just 2 things. 1, we identify people who care deeply about climate and the environment, yet aren't voting. And then 2, we turn them into better voters. That's it. We use data science to find environmentalists who don't vote, and then behavioral science to turn them into more consistent voters. What that also means is that we don't do a lot of the stuff that you might typically imagine an environmental nonprofit doing. For instance, we don't endorse candidates. We don't lobby for particular policies. We don't even, as odd as it might seem, try to convince people to care more about climate change or the environment. A good way to think of us is we're not even in the mind-changing or opinion-changing business at all. Instead, we are solely in the behavior-changing business. Our whole approach is, let's bypass the hardest, messiest stuff of politics, which is changing people's minds, and instead find the people who are already with us. They don't need their minds changed. They don't need their opinions changed. They just need to start getting their butts out the door on election day. And so because of that, we work a lot in really cutting edge voter targeting. We do a lot of behavioral science work to figure out the right way to message people to get them to vote. If you want to talk more about that during the Q&A or during the panel discussion, awesome. But as part of our work, there are 3 things that I think are crucially important that I just wanted to touch on today to give you a feel of some of the really important, yet often, I think, underappreciated aspects of modern environmental politics. So it's going to be these 3 things. 1, the biggest problem the modern climate movement faces, and I rarely say such bold statements like that, but I feel comfortable doing this, is that we don't have enough political power. We do not have enough political power, and I don't think that can be stressed enough. We already have a lot of the policies that we know would make an enormous difference. We already have a lot of the technologies that we know would make a difference. We already understand the science at a level that we can figure out what the problems are. The single biggest remaining hurdle is a lack of political will to get these things done. And obviously that's not a small thing, that's an enormous thing. That's why you are discussing it right now and we're discussing it. But I think that's important to touch upon because a lot of people don't quite understand where power lies in the modern American political system, why environmentalists don't have it, yet could. 2, I'm going to discuss public voter files. Yeah, I know that sounds boring, but if there's one thing, just one thing you remember from this 20-25 minutes, let it be about public voter files. I swear to God, it's important. And then 3, we're going to talk about some of the other points of political leverage in the climate and environmental movement, just so you're aware that even though media often focuses on one corner or another corner of sort of the political arena, there are a lot of points of leverage for those of us who care about climate and the environment. Okay, let's start with the first thing here. This is just one poll, but you'll have to take my word for it. It is like pretty much any poll you could find anywhere for any election. Now, this particular poll happens to be a poll of likely voters, so that's people who have a history of voting in a midterm election. And this poll was taken just in battleground states. So this was taken about a year ago in the lead up to the midterm election. And they asked these likely voters, what are your top 3 political priorities? 15% of them listed climate change or some environmental issue in there as one of their top 3 priorities. Now, the good news is that's a lot more than you would have seen if we asked that question in 2018 or 2014 or 2010. But I would like to suggest to you that that is nowhere close to what we need it to be if politicians are going to spend their political capital trying to address these issues. And if we narrow that question down to just what's your number 1 most important priority, not your top 3, your number 1, only 4% of likely voters in battleground states in last year's midterm said climate change or some other environmental issue. We in the environmental movement need to be honest with ourselves that that isn't close to being enough. You know, normally advocacy groups like to pound their chests and pretend that they're really strong and people need to be scared of them. You know, we are weak. We in the climate movement are weak. We do not have close to the amount of political power that we need. Because when you only have 4% of voters listing your issues as their top priority, not only does it make it hard to elect the so-called right people, but even when you do elect them, boy, is it hard for them to justify spending their political capital on your issue. I mean, we all know, whether you've been involved in politics or not, you know that just because someone gets elected, they can't snap their fingers and get whatever they want, right? They need to pick and choose which items they're going to go out on a limb on. And they ain't going to do it for 4% of likely voters. Now, for some of you might be thinking, oh, you know, I'm used to seeing all these polls that say 70 or 80% of Americans want government action on climate change or things like that. No, you're not wrong. There are polls like that. But the first thing I'd like you to really try to internalize is that in the political arena, there's an enormous difference between voter preferences and voter priorities. There are a lot of things that voters would prefer government action on, but that doesn't mean it's an important issue to them. I'd imagine that 80% of Americans want to get rid of daylight savings. But you're not going to have a presidential election decided on that one issue because it's not salient. It's not really important to them. It's not a priority. It is just a preference. Priorities are what really drives campaigns, as well as personalities and things like that. And it certainly is what drives policymaking. And there aren't nearly enough voters who prioritize climate and environmental issues. All right. Why is this so important? It gets to that second thing that I mentioned to you. This is so important because although who you vote for is secret, whether you vote or not is public record. Now, it might seem like I'm zagging into a completely different topic here, but stay with me. I just want to reiterate, whether you vote or not is public record. If you skip a midterm election, I know that. Your neighbors know that. Anybody who wants to look that information up can figure that out. Now, no one ever knows who you vote for. That's secret. But whether you vote or not is public record. And here's why that's important. Let's say Jill is running for governor of Connecticut. I think you live in Connecticut, Jill. Maybe you live in New York. Okay, great. So Jill's running for governor of Connecticut, and she's hired me to be her campaign manager. So let me bring you into the first meeting of the Jill Abramson for Governor campaign. We do what everybody does on campaigns, and the first thing we do is we open up our laptops and we look at public voter files. And we see, okay, who in Connecticut has a history of voting in gubernatorial elections? Over here, there's a whole group of people who aren't even registered to vote. Not going to talk to them. Oh, over here, oh yeah, these people are registered, but we can see on public voter files that they've never voted before. Not going to talk to them. Oh, here are some people who do vote, but only in presidential elections. And the gubernatorial races coincide with the midterms in Connecticut. So, I mean, maybe if Jill raises a ton of money, we'll talk to those people who vote in presidentials, but probably not. Oh, here are people who do vote in gubernatorials. Yeah, we'll talk to them. Oh, and here are people who even vote in like city council and mayor. We'll definitely talk to them. Not to put too fine a point on it, but we literally know these people by name and street address. And what is Jill's goal? Jill's goal is not to be the most popular person in Connecticut. Jill's goal is to get 50% plus one of the vote on a Tuesday in November, period. And she literally knows by name and street address which citizens of Connecticut have a history of voting in the election she's trying to win and which don't. And so what this means is that not always, but usually, campaigns only target likely voters. And if they ever dip into that universe of people who don't have a history of voting in that election, it's only with their last dollar, not their first. And if campaigns are only going to target likely voters, well, who do you think they're going to poll to figure out what issues they care about? Do you think they're going to poll all the people who have a history of not showing up in the election that Jill's trying to win? No. They're going to poll likely voters. And that's why polls like this one are such bad news for the environmental movement. Because right now, when you poll voters or likely voters, which for obvious reasons are the only people politicians care about, far, far too few of them list climate and the environment as a top priority. Now, the reason I wanted to dive into these two things is to help you understand that because it is public record who votes and who doesn't vote, the entire American public is not something that politicians really spend much time paying attention to, nor do they even spend much time paying attention to all registered voters, because they literally know by name and street address who has a history of voting in these elections that they're trying to win. Those are the people who are first-class citizens. Those are the people who are helping drive not only political decisions, but policy decisions. And the flip side of that coin is, if you don't vote, I'm sorry, but politicians just don't care about your preferences or your priorities or your opinions. They don't. And I know that sounds cynical, but guys, like this is something you accept in every other part of your life, right? Like you don't expect Ford Motor Company to care about 2-year-olds and market cars to them. No, 2-year-olds can't drive. 2-year-olds don't buy cars. So Ford Motor Company says, forget it. Well, politicians do the same thing. Politicians market themselves and their policies to people who vote, to people who elect politicians. They don't care about the ones who don't vote. And I know you've spent some time talking about the influence of corporate money and fossil fuel industry money in politics. And believe me, it is enormous. But at the end of the day, you know what they do with that money? They're not putting it in envelopes and stuffing it in the pockets of politicians, at least usually not. No, they're buying political ads to what? Get votes. It all comes down to votes. All right. The second thing that I think is important to understand just about these polls is, although, believe me, I'm not going to be all doom and gloom here, although only 4% of likely voters, at least in midterms, it's a little bit higher in presidentials, list climate and the environment as a top priority. That doesn't mean that it would be the same number if we stepped back and broadened our view and looked at a much wider audience. Now, as I just said, politicians don't do that, right? Because politicians care about winning elections, so they look at what voters think. But let's say we looked at all non-voters too. Well, it turns out there are huge numbers of them who care deeply about climate and the environment. So why, when we look at likely voters, is the number so small? Well, for one pretty good reason. It turns out that environmentalists are disproportionately awful voters. And I'm happy to get into why, some things we know and some things we don't know during the Q&A or during the panel discussion. But for the time being, it's important to just realize when you drill down in that previous poll that I was showing you, and again, you just have to take my word for it, pretty much every poll will show you the same thing. There's an enormous difference between likely voters and unlikely voters. So this was one question asking people the importance of climate change when choosing a candidate. Well, in Nevada, a big battleground state, only 5% of likely voters said climate's the single most important factor when choosing a candidate. But look, if you go to unlikely voters in Nevada, twice as many of them say climate's the top priority. Same thing in Pennsylvania. A really important thing to understand is that the environmental movement has a turnout problem. And we spend so much time thinking about opinion changing and mind changing in the climate movement. How are we going to persuade people to care more about this or that or the other thing? Well, the truth is, there are a whole bunch of people who are already persuaded who just are sitting on the sidelines, at least when it comes to politics. They're not voting. Now, obviously, this is important to me because the nonprofit I run finds non-voting environmentalists and then turns them into consistent voters. But I think it's important to you because I'm trying to lay out 3 things that I think are important for you to get a deeper and more nuanced understanding of the political points of leverage in modern American politics, at least when it comes to environmental issues. And a thing that's so important to understand is that politics isn't just about changing minds. It is also about changing the denominators, right? Like every fraction has a numerator and a denominator. And to assume that the same number of people vote every time there's an election, well, campaigns have to do that because campaigns only last at most like a year. But that doesn't mean that the rest of us have to do that. We can start pulling people in from the sidelines. And ultimately what this means, this is the last slide here, and this is the third thing I want to touch on, is that so much of how the media talks about climate politics and environmental politics is focused on 1 or 2 things that people are obsessed with, right? Who's going to win the federal general election? Or what group just did something really provocative on the highway? But there are so many other points of leverage that happen at so many other important moments in time. And I'm just showing you sort of the political sphere here. Obviously, there are so many other ways to make an impact in the climate and environmental space. Let's just look at elections, right? You have general elections, you have primaries, you have special elections, you have runoff elections. If you're not sure what I mean by these, please ask when we get to the Q&A. If you're in those elections, well, they could be for a lot of different types of offices, right? It could be federal office or state office or municipal office or county office or Congress or a state legislature or a city council. If you're in a campaign or if you're supporting a candidate, As I just mentioned, there are a lot of different ways to move the dial and get votes in elections like this. One is changing people's minds, voter persuasion. How do I come up with a great ad to change someone's mind so they care about climate, but they didn't before? Well, that's hard. That's hard, but that's important. But you can also change the denominators, not just the numerators. You can register more voters. You can mobilize more people who already agree with you. And then certainly outside of the electoral part of the political sphere, there are non-electoral parts of the political sphere that are very important to the climate and environmental movement. There's direct lobbying, there's PR campaigns, there's public protests and things like that. But for all of this, I would like to suggest to you that it's really, really important to understand that at the end of the day, despite the deeply partisan times that we live in, there is still one thing that unites all Democrats and Republicans. And that is, boy, do they all like winning elections. I mean, nothing motivates them more than the prospect of winning or losing an election. And when there are far fewer environmentalists voting than we need, and many, many more who are not voting, I would suggest to you that this is something that you should keep in mind as you go throughout your career at college and beyond, because this is a really underutilized point of leverage in the climate movement. Obviously, we should be pushing on all these buttons here, but a big one is understanding that politicians really just care about this small slice of registered voters. And most of us who care about climate and the environment aren't in it yet. And we're losing a lot of power that way. Okay, we've got like 6 minutes before we get to the panel. So hopefully I left enough time for a few questions there.
Well, actually, why don't we bring the panel on now?
Oh, great.
More generally. So can I invite Professor Faber and Professor Mustafa to come up and join us? Jill, do you want to come up as well? That would be great. Okay, so that was really interesting and I think a good sort of tonic and wake-up call. But let me ask the panelists to kind of start things and introduce you. So Professor Faber is a professor here at Northeastern. He's the director of the Northeastern Environmental Justice Research Collaboration. He also co-founded the International Journal of Capitalism, Nature, and Socialism. So I think we know where his politics lie. And Dr. Mustafa has more than a dozen years experience as an engineer and as a scholar and as a professor working in third world countries with the challenges they face. But Professor Faber, if we could maybe start with you a little bit about kind of when you hear what Nathaniel's talking about, how does that intersect with what you're trying to do and your sense of how we move the needle on climate change?
Well, I'd say the main hat I'm wearing tonight is Senior Research Fellow at the Global Center for Climate Justice.
Okay.
We're working in this area. In fact, we just put out a major report on the attack on voting rights and voter suppression in the United States. And I would say we're really here tonight to talk about two twin crises, the global climate crisis and the crisis of democracy. And we're seeing a profound attack that's being launched against the climate change movement, the notion that climate change is real, by what I call a polluter industrial complex, which is major corporate polluters, including the oil and gas industry. It's 128 key organizations of this. They've created 91 think tanks just devoted to convincing the American public that climate denial, climate change is not real, and that we don't need to take it seriously and take serious action. And $900 million a year makes this the most well-funded corporate propaganda campaign in the history of the US. And over the last few years, and I think this is a key point that relates to what we just heard, they've created a very sophisticated infrastructure of think tanks and policy institutes to carry forth this message. Those very same think tanks and policy institutes, that same infrastructure, is now leading a profound attack on voting rights and promoting different bills that are aimed at voter suppression of exactly the types of voters that he was describing. So 2021, over 400 bills introduced in state legislatures all over the United States aimed at pulling back voting rights. I believe it was 383 in 2022 and 322 this year alone, and we're not even through. And what these bills are disproportionately aiming at are the strongest, the voters with the strongest pro-environment, pro-climate change voting records in the United States, which is primarily low-income communities of color, which are often on the front lines of the climate crisis, as well as ecological crises, and young voters, because they often have the strongest voting records. So in the state of Texas, for example, we passed an initiative where you can't have a polling place on a college campus. You can vote, right? They had voter ID laws, which are really targeted towards youth, and as well as people of color. Something like 27% of all African Americans in the United States don't have a driver's license. So when you acquire a driver's license, you're disenfranchising those voters. So in the state of Texas, you can show a hunting license, but you can't show a student ID if you have a voter ID requirement. And the reason, again, is these are the strongest pro-environmental voters in the country. Often they are engaged in these struggles at the grassroots about building pipelines and so forth. So I think these two issues are deeply, deeply connected. Those are the likely voters that are being targeted by major corporate polluters to disenfranchise them and to keep them from voting. The Asian Congressional Caucus has the strongest environmental voting record in Congress, followed by the Hispanic Congressional Caucus, followed by the African American or the Black Congressional Caucus. Those three caucuses have the strongest voting right records. So if you can disenfranchise people of color and youth, you have done a great deal to disempower the climate change and environmental movements in the United States.
So, Professor Mustafa, let me ask you, if you're looking at kind of the impact globally, I mean, we're talking about the US, is that wrong, or is there kind of a ripple effect? I mean, how does what's going on in other parts of the world connect to what's going on here?
Thank you. I think the tragedy of the situation is that those people who have contributed the least to global warming are going to pay the most of the cost of climate change. And I think that that's obvious because of the ability and inability to, they don't have the infrastructure. But I was struck by the Daniel presentation. You have this slide on jurisdiction where you have the municipal, you have the state, and you have the federal. I will add another circle, which is maybe international. The implication of voting will result in withdrawing from the Paris Agreement would be a tremendous, it would be a tremendous impact. It's not just within the national North America or United States. I think voting is really important. Voting is seriously important because they are those people who are not able to speak for themselves. Not only the traditional poor, but as you said, the poor within North America, the marginalized and poor within North America who are going to suffer the most. I think I really appreciate what you brought here for attention. I teach a course here. I have some of my students from project management. I teach a course in resilience and sustainability. I am also affiliated with an institute in DC, Institute for Sustainable Infrastructure, ISI. So ISI has this metrics, or how do we know that what we are doing is sustainable in terms of infrastructure? What strikes me also is that these metrics are not affordable for those places. For example, the United Nations had this 17 development goals, right? That which is kind of so not only they are going to suffer, those marginalized and poor people, not only they are going to suffer, but the solutions that we are imposing on them are not affordable, right? We expect people in the global south to kind of be sustainable, right? They have to or not to do certain things in order not to harm the sustainability score. So I think it is important to think of the motto of the environmental movement, that you have to act locally but think globally. I think it's very important. So I wanted to emphasize what Ned and Antonio said, that please vote. Thank you.
So Jill, let me ask you, actually, this all sounds very familiar to our discussion about the courts.
I was just gonna say.
So can you
that.
talk a little bit about this, and I think, we're learning more and more that these various groups have been mobilizing for a long time on a range of issues.
Yes, and your presentation was music to my ears, because the very same groups we discussed in the two classes where we put our attention on the judiciary, the man named Leonard Leo, who was head of the Federalist Society and dispensed millions upon millions of dollars to put arch conservatives on the federal courts, especially the Supreme Court. He is now in charge of a political group aimed at voter suppression. So, having accomplished a conservative supermajority on the Supreme Court, he has now turned to keeping progressives from casting their votes, which is a critical connection to me. That some of the same interests that have been pouring money into the conservative infrastructure in the courts are very active in trying to keep progressives from voting and to keep conservative politicians in office.
So Nathaniel, I wanted to ask you, I think by the time you were done, half of us were ready to run outside, get the voting list and start pounding on the door of our neighbors, to get out there. But, and I it is interesting, I think that, it's not 5%, it's 10%, but that's still not, 45%. And I'm wondering what your sense is in terms of then how you persuade these voters, how you get them to turn out. And more broadly, again, our students are going to be going into jobs either for companies, maybe they'll work for a biotech firm, or maybe they'll work in government, maybe they'll work in a newsroom. How do all those factors factor in? Before he left, he had to go to a meeting. Professor Landsmark said something interesting to me. He said, 20 years ago, everybody was smoking. Gays couldn't get married. There were all these issues that seemed sort of
Seatbelts.
unsolvable. I'm sorry?
He mentioned seatbelts.
Seatbelts, right. Nobody would wear a seatbelt. And yet we've managed over time to kind of change all those. Was that just a voting issue, or are there other factors that have to be mobilized in something like this?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and actually those examples are very helpful, because when you think of seatbelts or cigarettes or same-sex marriage, our understanding of the science or the health impacts didn't change at all, really, from the 80s to now. What changed was how society interacted with those things and viewed them. Our societal norms changed, which then made political action happen really, really quickly. And that gets to the first part of your question. What does it take to persuade these people to vote? Well, it is not logically convincing them of the importance of their vote. We are all overeducated, hyperlogical people who like to think that there is a rational basis for every decision. But the simple truth is, and I'm not saying this as someone who has a secret here, Any behavioral scientist can tell you the last 20 or 30 years of behavioral economics and behavioral psychology and behavioral sociology has shown that usually the best ways to get people to take an action, whether it be voting or eating healthy or exercising more often, is not to treat them as a rational being. It is instead to treat them as a social being. It is to message to them in a way that feeds into how they want to be viewed by others, how they fit into the world. And I know that makes us uncomfortable. We think, oh, that's really manipulative and that's icky. Yeah, but that's who we are. We are a pathologically social species who spend all of our time trying to figure out, how do I act in the right way? How do I present myself to the world so that I am viewed in a particular way? Okay, so I'm speaking in very large sort of theoretical terms. What does this mean practically speaking? Well, we have run dozens of randomized control trials figuring out which messages work best to get these non-voting environmentalists to vote. What never works is saying, hey, you care about climate change, you should really vote in this election because it's really important for X, Y, and Z issues related to climate change. Instead, what works best, and it's not just us, it's other people in the voter turnout business, is using like juvenile fourth grade playground peer pressure. Like, hey, Jill, did you know last time there was an election, 127 people on your block of Main Street turned out to vote? Peer pressure works, as does appealing to other societal norms. If any of you have ever volunteered for a campaign before, chances are you've knocked on a door, you've spoken to someone and asked them to sign a card saying that they were going to vote. Well, the magic in that is it allows the campaign to come back to that voter right before the election and say, hey, Jonathan, I just want to remind you, back in October, you said that you were going to vote and the election's coming up on Tuesday, and we know it's important to you to keep your promise and be a good voter. Well, now, instead of me trying to convince Jonathan of the value of his one vote over a denominator of millions, which, let's face it, is really hard, I'm equating the act of voting with whether he's an honest person or not, whether he's someone who keeps his promises or not. Those are the types of messages that are really, really powerful. And even, I know most of you aren't going to be going door to door or working on a campaign, simply by posting on social media that you are a voter sends a powerful social signal to your friends and peers, because all of them are looking to you for cues on how to act appropriately, how to be a good environmentalist, how to be a good citizen, how to be a good person. And much of your superpower as a member of our species is that social power. You have the ability to show to your peers what appropriate behavior is. And you need to do that by voting.
Okay, Professor Faber, I'd like to return to you. I'm going to turn it off to the audience, turn it over to students for questions next. And as social animals, remember what we said about extensions for paper. So we're going to be counting on that.
And peer pressure.
And peer pressure. But that's one question I wanted to ask you, Professor Faber. So in a sense, part of what Nathaniel's arguing is it's sort of like this kind of roundabout approach, right? But I'm wondering, from a point of view of what corporations are doing, the way the economy is structured, does it have to be almost this stealth approach to getting people to vote for the environment? Or are climate and justice something that really has to be at the center of people's thinking? And how would that work?
So those tactics definitely apply and are utilized, but I worked with the Sanders campaign to do this type of messaging. I wrote this environmental justice platform. McKibben and I wrote this climate justice platform.
Can you tell them who McKibben is?
Bill McKibben is a leading, he's founder of 350.org and one of the leading voices and activists in the United States around climate change.
You can read him in the New Yorker just about every other week these days.
And he's been a climate champion for decades now. And a couple things that we felt were really important was that, and there have been numerous studies which have documented this in the critiques of the media and so forth. Big study done at Northwestern. There's been many of the climate scientists themselves have undertaken studies of the media.
Yeah.
And one of the things that comes up quite a bit is often when you discuss climate change, it's discussed as an abstraction. There will be these impacts by the end of the century in sort of global generic terms, but it's really difficult for people to see how that's impacting them in the here and now. And very often when you present these very alarming scenarios, because let's face it, that the climate crisis is a planetary emergency. It does represent an existential threat to humanity. And it's very easy for people to retreat in fear or despair and feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of the science. And the messaging and the analyses that have been done in the field show that you have to create a positive vision of how engaging in the movement and taking on climate change can create a better society. Our executive director, Christina Schlegel, when we founded the center, this was a key philosophy of ours. She wrote the Green New Deal platform with Michelle Wu, running for mayor. And the idea is when we can create such a vision, then people will be excited to come out to vote. They'll be excited to become part of the movement because it's necessary for creating a better future. And our role as both academics, scientists, and activists is to help construct that vision of how dealing with the climate crisis can create such a better future. And we've been doing a very poor job at it, to be frank about it. And the other thing that's often happening in the media, there's this notion of both sidism, and where many of the media are going to present both sides of the issue, as if there isn't a broad consensus, an overwhelming consensus in the scientific community that climate change is real. That often it's presented as, oh, there are two different sides, and that could lead to some confusion. People might say, oh, well, it's not as bad, or there's a lot of doubt. So we can talk about the need for the media to come down and show that this is a major crisis. There is broad consensus in the scientific community that it's an imminent threat. And then on the part of movement activists and the media to demonstrate how people are being impacted in very profound ways here and now. If inflation is the number one issue, and a big source of that is high energy prices, then obviously the transition to clean green energy is an anti-inflationary measure. So we have to learn how to deal with climate change as it connects to issues of social and economic justice, but other issues that people care about. This is taking an intersectional approach. If we just treat it as in a policy silo, it's not going to have the power that it should. And the reality is that climate is related to every other issue. And so there is a movement afoot. And we've been in some very interesting meetings of late with some major organizations in the climate change movement around the formation of the Declaration of American Democracy. It's 240 different organizations that are coming together to figure out how can we build cross-movement coalitions around social, racial, environmental, climate justice, and make the preservation of democracy the most important goal of all these coalitions, because if we don't have a functioning democracy, we're not going to win on any of these issues. So I'm actually really heartened by what I'm seeing now. We're seeing a transformation beginning to take place in movement circles of a recognition that even though we may come from different walks of life, we're all impacted by this crisis in different ways. And we have to make that evident to people so that they can see voting for the climate is in their self-interest and in their immediate interest.
I'm going to turn over to
If I-
students in a second, but I just, Christine, would you mind putting you on the spot? Because you've actually, you work with Bernie Sanders, you've been working with Mayor Wu. Can you tell us a little bit about concretely how this works in policy and how politicians can be persuaded to adopt this as a comprehensive way? Would you mind coming down here just because for our microphones, they pick you up better if you're sitting next to Professor Mustafa.
Sure, do you want to repeat what?
Sure. So, well, I guess, it was fascinating to hear kind of this broad political sense of how you create a message when you're dealing with a politician, a mayor.
Yeah.
How did it work with Mayor Wu, and what did you persuade her to do? And how has she packaged it in a way that it might work or might not?
Yeah, I mean, one caveat there is that, Mayor Wu is really unique among politicians. She does her homework, she listens to people, she gets it. But we've started to have these conversations with other mayors and other cities and other grassroots Green New Deal coalitions. And I will say, even for Mayor Wu, it was a number of years in terms of advocacy organizations in the city. And I had already done a research report for her on climate justice back in 2017 that helped kind of flip the narrative a little bit. And she began to understand how all of the issues in an urban environment are connected. And that connecting thread is climate justice. So when you're talking about housing policy, there are climate implications and racial justice implications and economic implications. So to really link those up. And I think it's really just a sort of gelling of an understanding. I think what folks maybe underestimate is the need to, in a good way, educate our elected officials around issues. Because if you look at state houses, many of them are working super part-time. They may or may not have like a part-time assistant, researcher, scheduler. A lot of them don't necessarily have the previous expertise, breadth of knowledge to understand like the best thing and the best policy that they can put forward, given their relative power at the local, state, or federal level. So yeah, I would say just having conversations, having spaces where you can educate your elected officials and building movements that consistently provide that message to them has been really, really effective.
And I think this argument, and I think that Nathaniel kind of started this idea that it's not just at the presidential level, but it's also at the local level. So my son happens to be the elected town clerk of Brookline, Massachusetts, and as part of his job is to run a town meeting. Brookline doesn't have a mayor. They have a town meeting of 200 to 300 people who get together like they're in the 1750s and meet and then pass all these resolutions to set policy in Brookline. And Brookline became the first town to pass regulations that forbid use of gas heat in any new construction. And there have now been movements elsewhere about gas stoves. And this is sort of your classic, all politics is local kind of thing. And so suddenly in Brookline, I mean, that's a major step to take. And it's at a kind of part of the government that most people they don't even know it exists. It's not like a big campaign issues. But again, I think one of the things we've seen with the corporate and other kind of money going into elections is that the right wing has been very good now at working at the local level, right? They're not just focusing on the Supreme Court, they're working on school boards and trying to kind of block change that way.
Can I just?
Jonathan, can I just?
Yes, how about Nathaniel, then Jill, and then.
I just want to quickly bring up, I think, a very important distinction that we need to keep in mind. There are persuasion problems that need to be solved with a particular type of messaging, and there are mobilization problems that need to be solved with a particular type of messaging. And I think Professor Faber brought up some really, really good examples of ways that compelling messages can be crafted to further convince people who need further convincing, or to convince them to begin with and get them excited about something. But I think it's also important to realize that oftentimes we are not trying to change minds. Sometimes we're just trying to get people who are already with us to take a particular action. And oftentimes the messages that you use for those two things are completely different. Just like in a beer commercial, they would never bother to tell you what the ingredients are in the beer and how awesome it's going to taste. Instead, they're just going to say, hey, do you want to be like this cool dude? Well, then buy our beer. And I think we need to be open to that. We need to be open to the sociological research that sometimes tells us, hey, if you're not in the mind-changing arena, if you're just in the behavior-changing arena, maybe the best way to get climate or environmentalists to vote is not to talk about climate or the environment at all, because they're already with us. I just think it's really important to sort of keep those two lanes of messaging separate.
Sure. Jill.
I just want to make the quick point, hearing you talking about Mayor Wu, is that politicians and journalists have something important in common, which is they are constantly in search of people who have authoritative usable, bankable information. And that if you're trying to get access to a politician, one of the best ways is somehow proving or showing that you have valuable information for them. Just like I'm gonna go back to the source on the environment or any issue that I'm writing about, who has provided me with excellent, reliable, truthful information.
Okay, questions?
I was curious what you think the role of greenwashing is, in a lot of this, and how some corporations might cover up not only the true extent of climate change, but also what's actually being done on the corporate side.
So I just want to repeat the question because we have a live stream audience. So the question is, what about greenwashing and the way in which corporations will kind of either be deceptive or, try to present this image that they're doing a lot.
Can I
when it's
just
not
jump
true.
in here with a footnote to your question, which is that every Thursday for decades, Mobil Oil, which is part of the Exxon conglomerate, took out an op-ed in the New York Times every Thursday to present this wonderful image of itself as a great corporate citizen, concerned about everything, the environment and whatever. And, the Times itself made a lot of money on these ads. So it's what you're talking about is very deeply ingrained in our information delivery system.
And I want to ask Professor Faber, but I will say I was on YouTube looking for various videos we might share and have you watch. And what's so interesting, because of course, on the internet, everything can be targeted. If you go on YouTube and Google, environmental, whatever videos, everyone has a commercial at the beginning. At Delta, we know how important it is to limit carbon emissions. At GE, we're doing this. I mean, you would think, well, we've solved climate change because every major company is clearly behind it. Now, you wouldn't see that if you were trying to book a flight to Aruba or something like that. But Professor Faber, what about the greenwashing issue, which is maybe part of the kind of denialist effort, or?
I want to take a stab at it, but I'm gonna let him go first.
Fair enough.
I think it is really very good and important questions. I think that one of the ways for this is rigor and metrics. I wanted to encourage you to look at ISI criteria for sustainability. So they have these 5 criteria of quality of life, leadership, and natural allocations and so on. When you have a claim like this, you want auditing and you want a third-party verification, right? So I think it is important, especially when you are doing large-scale intervention. Right? So in my case, it's infrastructure. So there is this project doing development in Boston, and they're claiming that this is sustainable development. They are metrics, just like they are engineering codes, they are environmental sustainability metrics. One of the famous one, of course, is LEED, right, for the building. But for infrastructure, you have ISI. They call it Envision. It started here at Harvard, now become an institute in DC. So if you have a claim, you have to evidence your claim. So you are saying, for example, my project address social justice issues and equity. So kind of show us the evidence. I think the auditing and third-party verification is very important for this.
I would just like to make 2 really quick points. The first is there's been numerous studies on this, and some 95% of the claims that are made by corporations in their advertising are either false or grossly misleading. So the vast majority of the environmental ads, which have become more and more predominant as there's a growing environmental consciousness in the United States, are inappropriate and incorrect. And this is important because as informed citizens, you would like to use your consumer dollars to reward those corporations that are doing the right thing. But if we're receiving misinformation, then your ability to direct the marketplace becomes grossly inhibited if you're not getting correct information through advertising. So greenwashing is pervasive. The second point I would make, and your example is a good one, I've cataloged a lot of them, there's so many around ExxonMobil alone. And the amount they spend on advertising is massive. The other thing, there's really been a profound change in the climate denial machinery in the United States by the polluter industrial complex and the oil and gas industry in particular. They moved away from denialism. Because the climate crisis is now so obvious. Last year, 1 out of every 2 Americans live in a county that had a climate related disaster. And 10 years ago, it was 10%. So the climate crisis is here. It's become very obvious. We had a meeting with Jane Fonda the other night, who started a super PAC, who's trying to do exactly what Nathaniel is talking about. And that is to really promote pro-environment candidates. And she had a very interesting line. This is the first generation that has entered the Anthropocene, where climate change is now obvious to all of us, but it's also the only generation that can stop it. And so this is a really unique,
Because of the urgency.
because of the urgency of the moment, we only have 7 years to see our emissions reduced by 43%, or we're going to begin passing certain tipping points from which we can no longer stop the process. So that's what scientists mean when they call this a climate emergency. So they're moved beyond denialism to now speak in terms of language. Well, it's real, and we're part of the solution. We're going to promote clean natural gas, or they're adopting more and more tactics which are aimed at delaying this transition and engage in incrementalism. But the latest numbers are startling. You realize that the United States, just this past month, produced 13.2 million barrels of oil a day, which is double the rate in 2012. We now produce more oil than at any time in our history. And the same is true globally. So overall energy use is going up. Renewables are becoming a bigger part of that, 17%. But overall fossil fuel use is continuing to go up. So if the industry has its way in terms of delaying serious action, and if they are successful in exploiting the some $100 trillion worth of known fossil fuel assets that are in the ground, then scientific community says that will take us 5 times beyond what is safe, and we will live in a world that's 11 degrees Fahrenheit warmer by the end of the century, which portends about 40% of global ecosystem collapse, because you simply cannot withstand that form of warming. So this is what it's meant by the scientific community, that we are facing a planetary emergency. And so delay tactics, making themselves part of the solution, that's the new form of greenwashing.
Actually, Dr. Mustafa, can I just one question, then I'll come back to you, Joe. We're talking a lot about the US.
Right.
When you talk about the global South and these poor countries, do they have any leverage, or how does it work in those countries in terms of the messaging, bringing pressure on governments? I mean, what's the political dynamic there, or are they just kind of pawns in whatever the Western world does or China does?
I think recently there is this kind of collaboration and coordination in the regions, and they're putting, I think, good pressure in these international arenas. Right? And I think another way of doing this, which we can build on what Nathaniel is saying, we are ontologically social species. The shaming, I think, it will work here. These people have not contributed to the global warming, and they are suffering the most, and the victims of this. So I think that's important. I am also interested, Professor Kaufman, here to hear from the international students in Northeastern University, because some of them are coming from the front line of this suffering.
And some of them come from the maybe front lines of good things being done.
Especially in the environmental
Yes,
movement,
that's
right?
what I mean, but internationally.
So maybe we want to hear from them. We want to hear from international students. What does it mean for them?
Okay, international students, think of something and we'll give Jill.
I just, because again, you know, we don't want to be gloom and doom. I think something really interesting is how do the fossil fuel industries, how can they be held accountable for the environmental damage they've caused and also be pressured to change their ways, which is critical. And I think, again, smoking is a very good analogy to think about because the tobacco companies were forced because of lawsuits that were filed against them to change their ways, to stop deceptive advertising and accept, you know, all kinds of restrictions on the way they promote and sell their products. And really to accept the fact that their reputation, in part because of these lawsuits, was being ruined. And what finally got to them, what finally held them accountable, was giant multi-million dollars, which today would be billion-dollar legal judgments and lawsuits against them. And right now, as recently as just this week, you have states and localities, including Massachusetts. This week, Governor Newsom in California, states and localities are suing Exxon for just this, for the fact that it's now known that Exxon itself had all of the scientific information long years ago showing exactly what carbon emissions did to the environment, and that they were deceptive in what they were telling the public and in their marketing. So I think if you see multi-billion-dollar judgments, and unfortunately New York's suit was first and it was thrown out on kind of technical grounds, but guess what state might be coming next in 2024? Massachusetts. Governor Healy, when she was Attorney General, sued Exxon. So keep your eye on that.
Questions? International students especially? Yeah.
Like, I think a lot of this.
Would you do me a favor? Would you come here and talk? It's just our microphones have trouble picking you up.
I was just kind of wondering, like, do you think that, like, I guess maybe this question from Daniel, but with all of this, like, misinformation being spread, do you think that we may see, like, increase of laws that go against misinformation and, like, media, or is it too embedded in the United States to have, like, freedom of press and freedom of companies that this may not go?
Did you hear that, Nathaniel?
Yes. Yeah, I did. I'm not optimistic that we'll have many laws about it. And that's largely because I think we live in a moment where almost everything is downstream of our political divisions. You know, if we had been having this conversation 10 or 15 years ago, I might have been a bit more optimistic that cooler heads would prevail. And for the health of the republic or the defense of the Constitution, maybe we'll fight against these things. But no, I think when there is a political party or another vested interest or a very powerful industry that benefits from disinformation, they are not going to let laws get passed that make it harder for disinformation like that to help them. And so I wish I could give you another answer, but no, I kind of feel like we're in a moment right now where everything is downstream from politics, religion, culture, your friend groups, everything.
Yeah. Would you mind coming down here? It's just easier for them to pick it up on the mics.
So I have a question about like the role of developing countries and what they're expected to do really, because if you look at history, like a lot of these countries are exploited for their natural resources. It's part of like the resource curse when you look at like the international, I guess like organization of different states and such. So, you know, these countries that were exploited for their resources and essentially have been the ones that are suffering the most at the hands of the profits of developed and poor countries. Like, why should they have to pay? You know, it's almost like this is definitely a global issue, but it doesn't seem like you're going to have all hands on deck because the people who did the damage aren't doing anything to resolve anything.
Take China.
Take China, yeah, I think it is really a dilemma, like, for example, one of the recommendations is that when you do this infrastructure in Africa, please do them in a sustainable way. And which is really not affordable. And people want roads and they want transportation systems. That is the first priority, right? The priority is here to have this infrastructure in the first place. Forget about the sustainability, right? So for them, first of all, they have not contributed to the global warming. Second, you are imposing on them solutions that they cannot afford, right? So I think it's really difficult question. Right? What
I
can they
think,
do?
I know a key illustration of the point that you are making is in Africa, where if you look at the mining industry, which wreaks havoc on the environment, you know, countries in Africa are they're rare, everything from rare minerals to gold is being stuffed out
Right.
in, you know, not environmentally conscious ways. And, you know, the power imbalance is just huge because the countries that have these resources are not a match for either a country like China, which
Right.
is sucking us all out, or for corporate interests, some of which are definitely American, which are sucking the same thing out.
Professor Faber, yeah.
I would just say, if I want to present the strong thesis that the primary function of neoliberal corporate-led globalization has been to facilitate the confiscation of natural resource wealth in the global south by transnational capital as well as domestic elites. We've had over the last 2 decades about 100,000 people a day at times displaced from their traditional lands because that land has been confiscated by domestic economic elites or transnational capital. And there you have a massive outflow of resource wealth from the global south to the north at depressed prices, which has subsidized the profits of transnational capital, but has left the global south in ecological ruins. And the other part of this that often doesn't get discussed too is not only the massive appropriation of natural resource wealth at undervalued prices, but also the displacement of massive what are called negative externalities in the form of pollution, toxic waste sites, electronic waste, all the environmentally harmful byproducts of industrial production in the global north are also being exported to the global south. And it's no accident then therefore we've seen this growth of an ecological crisis and then an environmentalism of the poor in the global south as they have lost access to their livelihoods. And the worst culprit in all of this has been the United States. If you look at the Rotterdam, Stockholm, the Basel Convention, all international treaties that are designed to prevent these forms of ecological imperialism, that 97% of all the nations of the world have signed on to, the United States refuses to sign on to them. And it acts in a very obstructionist manner when they are discussed at the United Nations. So this is an intentional policy that serves to benefit transnational capital. At the Global Center, we work with movements all over the global south that are looking to reclaim their democracies and reclaim control over their own communities and their own countries. And I would say the greatest solution to the climate crisis in the global south is actually more just and sustainable development models, which are not oriented toward meeting the needs of transnational capital, but are oriented to meeting the needs of people in those countries, the popular classes. That's the true solution. And that's what we're beginning to see the mobilize. Guterres just had this big UN conference a month and a half ago,
Gutierrez,
UN Secretary General, and United States does not show up. Biden doesn't show up. China, Russia don't show up. There's supposed to be $100 billion fund aid in this. It should be a $2 trillion fund to aid the global South in these transitions. I read in the islands of the South Pacific that are going to be literally washed away in the next 20 years. And they have no responsibility at all for the climate crisis. And the global North is turning their back for the most part on these countries in the global South. So I think it's time for the global South to form a renewed non-alignment movement and begin to work on trade between the countries, which is not free trade, but fair trade, and begin to act in each other's mutual interests, because I do not think the core countries of the global North are going to be responsive until we reclaim our own demise.
I think this is really very important point when it comes to resources. If you look at the map of Africa, if you look at the infrastructure, usually the infrastructure is meant to be between cities. So you have a circular infrastructure because you want this internal trade between countries and cities. In Africa, you will see the infrastructure a straight line from the middle of Africa to the port. Right? So it's not just policy, it's structural exploitation for hundreds of years. Right? When you put a highway, when you put a railway from central of Africa to the coast in the west, that's going to be for 100 years. Versus you have a circular roads or highway between cities. So it's not just policy, but it's a physical kind of impediment and exploitations, which is kind of really very frustrating.
If I could just add a thing wearing my domestic political hack hat, I think this brings us back to something that Professor Faber said at the very beginning that I think is very important, and that is how intersectionality fits into the domestic, at least American climate movement. I don't, as a domestic political guy, foresee a moment in time where the United States of America, out of the goodness of its heart, decides, hey, let's help all of these other countries do X, Y, and Z. We just don't have a history of doing that. Boy, would I wish it were otherwise, but I wouldn't put all my money on that. But there are so many very salient current domestic political issues that you could view through a global South climate lens, like, say, the immigration crisis. How much of the immigration crisis is tied to domestic trade policy, is tied to drought and extreme weather, is tied to economic sanctions? These are things that Americans do vote on and think about every day. And this is just one of many reasons. Believe me, there are many reasons why the climate movement needs to be intersectional. But if we want to get Americans to care more about the politics of helping the global South build in a sustainable way, we need to recognize that it's not the other side of the earth. All of the fear that is ginned up around the so-called immigration crisis is in many ways like the receipts of all of our bad international decisions over the last, 3-4 decades coming due. So I think that this is how a lot of that intersectionality feeds into not just domestic politics, but international policy.
We wrote a report that does exactly that for that reason.
yeah, Jill, and then we'll
I
have time
just
for one more
wanted
question.
to jump in with a last point that relates to my little history lesson earlier about Ida Tarbell and the investigation of Standard Oil, which did result in something concrete and good happening, which was passage of the first antitrust laws, which is that the family that controlled Standard Oil, the Rockefellers, John D. Rockefeller was the founder of Standard Oil, which has become Exxon today, actually has turned its back on its inheritance of the great wealth of John D. Rockefeller and has joined the climate fight against Exxon. And it was the Rockefellers who funded Inside Climate News's investigation of Exxon and also sent $200,000 to fund a Columbia Journalism School joint investigation that was published in the LA Times. And, you know, its members have publicly, the family members have publicly denounced Exxon. The head of the Rockefeller Family Foundation, which is a huge nonprofit, wrote a two-part himself investigation of Exxon. So things do change. It may take forever, but there are some positive steps happening.
And they divested and they're leaving the
That's
divestment
correct.
in the foundation for.
Another question?
So earlier on, we were talking about how, Mayor Wu became more aware of how intersectional these things are, especially with climate change. And that one of the issues is that our elected officials aren't always educated on these issues that need to be addressed. How would you suggest that we, approach that? It's not like we can just pressure our officials into reading literature and understanding research. And you can't impose a priority on someone. So how would you suggest we?
Christine, can we bring you in
And
also?
also
Yeah,
now,
everyone have a chance. Because you've done it, so tell us, tell us the secret sauce.
Want to start off now?
well, I was gonna turn to Nathaniel.
Okay,
but
well, let's start with Christine and then we'll go around.
Pressure. Nathaniel, you want to say something?
Sure. I mean, I think there are two separate issues here. The politician's priorities and educating the politician. And I do think it's important to keep them separate because, and I don't want to come off as too cynical here, because I actually have an enormous amount of respect for politicians. But, the brutal arithmetic of democracy is like, you need to go where the votes are. You don't get to be a politician anymore. Period. That's how it works. And so I'm not saying that politicians have no North Star. No, of course they do. Politicians care deeply about certain things, but they're not going to spend their political capital on it until voters demand that they do that. And sometimes that forces politicians to do things like quit. I mean, we saw a few members of the last Congress do it when they realized, you know what? I don't want to run for office anymore in a Republican primary because I think it's important to vote to impeach the president, so I'm just not going to run anymore. And that's fine. But usually if they want to stay politicians, their priorities are based on where the pressure is coming from the political marketplace. The separate issue, how to educate them, I'm so glad it was brought up earlier, and my colleague, I'm sorry, I forget your name, is going to address it, because this is also very important, especially when you get to local politicians. Oftentimes they want to do the right thing. They just need the information. And this is where amazing academic research comes in, like that done by Professors Faber and Mustafa, but also where lobbyists come in. And I know people have like an awful conception of lobbyists. And I say this as someone who's never been a lobbyist before, but oftentimes they are enormously helpful. Oftentimes they say, hey, this is a problem you might not be aware of, and here are some potential solutions. And obviously it's the politician's job to see through the BS, and usually there's a lot of it, but often they can be really, really helpful.
Christine.
Yeah, so I would say, in addition to education, and so let me back up a little bit. There's voting, but I don't want everyone to think that voting is your only way of participating in a democracy. If you are not seeing the changes that you want to see at the local level, state level, federal level, there's a myriad of other ways to put pressure on politicians. Writing letters to the editor,
Going to
protesting,
city council meetings.
city council hearings and meetings, forming coalitions as we've done with the Boston Green New Deal Coalition. That's currently, in support of work done by the city. And there are many, many other ways to voice your support or opposition or put forward what you want to see in your community and in your state. And so I would say that that is in addition to educating your legislators. That has to be part and parcel of it. To make sure, one, that they have to fully understand the issue, but to make sure that they deliver on it, which is honestly, sometimes the devil's in the implementation. It's in the delivery of those promises, of those plans. Sometimes they need a little fire under their bum.
And I would say another problem, and I'm curious to hear what Daniel might say about this, but there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the quality of the politicians running for office in environmental circles. And as you pointed out, too many environmentalists withdraw from participating in the electoral process. I think part of that too is because they're just not satisfied with the candidates. They just don't feel that they really reflect their values. We were at the Jane Fonda event, and so the formation of our super PAC is to encourage working with the movement to nominate candidates for office that are organically grounded in the movement, that come forward from the movement as a way of galvanizing greater support. And we were also, Ed Markey was there, so we're having a discussion with our Senator Ed Markey, who was the champion of the Green New Deal at the federal level. And he said something very interesting in our conversation. He says, sometimes you have to be visionary. You have to put out a political platform or vision where maybe the movement isn't yet there, but it will excite them and galvanize them and bring more people into the electoral process. And I think that's what happened, for example, with certain politicians like Markey, Ocasio-Cortez, and others in terms of advocating for Green New Deal. It's about inventing a new electoral politics about where we should be and whether or not they're getting that pressure from the movement or not. Sometimes the movement has to catch up to some of these politicians, but it's a way of generating excitement. So really supporting those politicians who do have that vision and exercise it and display it is really, really.
Okay, we've got like 5 minutes left, and I want to do like a quick lightning round, which is, can each of you talk, what would be your advice about what students can do, right? Because I think one of the things that clearly is out there is this feeling of just being overwhelmed. And I think you've all provided really interesting suggestions about levers of power and so forth. But, if students, Gen Z, this kind of new emerging group of voters and activists, what's a path for them or for all of us to kind of get change and not just throw up our hands and say, there's nothing we can do. Nathaniel, let's start with you, and then we'll just come around.
I would be outwardly, loudly political in your environmentalism. No matter what job you go into, every day of your life, use this social being superpower that all of you have, and just make sure that everybody in your life knows that it is important to you to be politically an environmentalist. And I know that seems small, but we're talking about little, like sort of high leverage actions you can do, right? Every day in your life, people are taking cues from you, I promise. And the environmental movement is so strangely apolitical in a way that most other movements aren't. We focus so much of our time and energy on apolitical personal behavioral changes, which is fine. Many of them are important. But we need to be loud and proud about our environmental activism such that all of your friends online, all of the friends you see on a daily basis know this person isn't going to respect me, and this person might not like me if they don't feel that I respect what they're doing. And I know that sounds manipulative, but that's kind of how you change things, is by manipulating them.
And
so
we
be
have
loud and proud.
And we have very recent evidence of that, right? George Floyd. I mean, suddenly, people were talking about systemic racism, even at Thanksgiving, even with your grandparents who were watching Fox News. And certainly now the whole debate over Israel and Hamas, whichever side you're on, is very much the part of almost every conversation. So that happens sometimes. So, Christine?
Yeah, I mean, just to follow off that, it's exercising your political muscle, and that's everything from voting to going to protests, to writing letters to the editor, getting involved in a student group, getting involved in a nonprofit here locally, going to a city council meeting. What are the city councilors doing? You know, figure out what's on the agenda. What are they talking about? Bring your friends. Or even at the State House, there's some really interesting discussions here and there, right? And it's helpful to have people show up in support of something. Because sometimes it will go to a hearing, you'll have an amazing hearing, then it gets taken for like years. So the more public support that we have in these public spaces and hearings, the better. So any which way you want to flex your political muscle and your voice, please do it.
Professor Mustafa.
I would say take your classroom to the neighborhood. Don't be a theoretical person. Take an issue and apply your knowledge. Be an organic intellectual. Don't be a theoretical person, right? You may write a very sophisticated paper, but it will be somewhere in the shelf. Nobody's going to read it. But you can take a very small thing in your neighborhood and apply your knowledge and your enthusiasm to that. I think that will make a difference.
I would endorse everything that's been said. I would say on a macro level that democracies do die when the people do not participate in the system. So it's very important right now. Our democracy is in trouble. There are 17 states where election deniers are now in charge of that election machinery. Alabama, it's the governor, the secretary of state, who oversees the elections process, the attorney general, who will rule on that. They're all election deniers. And Trump once said that elections aren't won by people who vote, they're won by the people who count the votes. So our democracy is in serious trouble right now, and we see the rise of authoritarianism around the world. So it's really crucial more than ever that you become involved in your democracy and help not just preserve it, but expand it, strengthen it, deepen it. Then the other thing I would say is at a professional level, often we see the climate crisis or the issue is detached from how we live our own lives and our own career aspirations. But there are billions and hundreds of billions of dollars coming down the pipe now to address the climate crisis with the IRA and Justice 40 and so forth. This is a historic opportunity. And we listen to these programs all the time. We talk to investors and so forth. There are not enough people with the expertise to do renewable energy technology, environmental engineers, green chemists, almost any field that you're involved in, even the field of psychology right now. There's a whole new area of climate grief where people are trying to deal with the trauma of both COVID and the climate crisis. That we need people going in and making this their career. Because the climate crisis isn't going to go away. We have to address it. And we need people trained in their specialties to make themselves part of that solution. So I would say take advantage of this educational opportunity, not only become involved in student groups, but look at how you can pursue a career path that can be part of the solution.
Joe?
Use the communication skills that you are gaining in this very class to communicate to your peers, and if you become a journalist, as I hope many of you will, to communicate to the public. Become knowledgeable about these environmental issues and learn how to communicate about them in an engaging and interesting and informed way.
Great. Well, thank you all. Really a terrific conversation. Really want to appreciate it. So we'll have 3 lines. Those who want to work on Global South issues can line up. So we'll see you next week. We'll be talking about China. And thank you all.
Thanks, Nathaniel.
Thanks, Nathaniel.
Thank you. Bye-bye.